Two fully loaded Boeing 747s are taxiing through the thick fog on the runway, preparing for takeoff. In a few moments, something will happen that will shock the world. How was this possible? Stay tuned.
Oh, they crashed before even taking off. I see. Yeah, so the basic gist of what I heard is that two airplanes somehow collided. I figured this was maybe in the air. I had no idea that this happened on a landing strip. Interesting.
A huge thank you to CuriosityStream for sponsoring this video. The story about the Tenerife airport disaster is filled with frankly incredible coincidences. Let's see at the end of this video if you can list all of the things that if they would have just happened slightly differently, this disaster could have been avoided. The chain of events starts on the 26th of March 1977 when Pan Am Flight 1736, which is a Boeing 747-100 with call sign Clipper 1736, takes off from Los Angeles International Airport with original destination New York to pick up some passengers and then fly down to Las Palmas in the Canary Islands. This flight is chartered by Royal Cruise Lines, and because it's a charter flight, it's completely fully booked on its last leg, and it's mostly elderly passengers who are due to get onto a cruise ship when they reach Las Palmas. Las Palmas is the capital of the Canary Islands and is situated on Gran Canaria, which is one of the 8 main islands of the island group. The Canary Islands is situated about 100 kilometers west of the Moroccan coastline, making it the most southern part of the Spanish territory. And because of its tropical and subtropical climate, it's a real hotspot for tourists from mainly Europe, but all over the world.
I know so many people who go there for tourism from Germany.
Now, the Canary Islands back in 1977 had a little bit of political friction going on. A group called the MPA-IAC was fighting for independence of the Canary Islands from Spain, or at least to get a little bit of recognition and attention by the central government. Now, they did so using both non-violent and violent political campaigns. And one of those campaigns is going to form the first piece of the puzzle leading up to this disaster.
Really? Somehow I never expected a political campaign to be part of such an airplane crash disaster.
In command of Pan Am Flight 1736 was 56-year-old Captain Victor Grubbs. Assisting him was 38-year-old First Officer Robert Bragg and 46-year-old flight engineer George Warnes. They were a very, very experienced flight crew, and they took over the flight in New York for the final leg down towards Las Palmas. When the aircraft arrived in New York, it was actually about 45 minutes delayed, which meant that the outbound flight down towards Las Palmas also became slightly delayed. At time 0742, Clipper 1736 took off from JFK International Airport in New York and started flying down over the Atlantic Ocean towards Las Palmas. On board there was a total of 16 crew members and 380 passengers.
Big flight.
While the Pan Am aircraft was making its way down over the Atlantic, another Boeing 747, a KLM flight 4805, was getting ready to depart from Amsterdam down towards Las Palmas airport. This was also a charter flight, chartered by Holland International Travel Group, and they were due to take their passengers from Amsterdam, bring them down to Las Palmas, and then make a turnaround down there, refill the aircraft, get new passengers on, and then fly back to Amsterdam as KLM flight 4806, making it a fairly long day for the involved crew. In charge of these two flights was Captain Jacob Veldhuisen van Santen. He was 50 years old at the time, and he was working as the chief flight instructor on the Boeing 747 fleet for KLM. This meant that he spent quite a lot of his operating hours in the simulator instructing other pilots and maybe not as much time in the actual aircraft.
So my model's covering it up, but it says total flying time, almost 12,000 hours, and time on the Boeing 747, 1,500 hours. Even though he just said that this guy didn't spend a ton of time flying, I do think like almost 12,000 hours is very impressive still. I feel like if my pilot had 12,000 hours flying time, I would trust them to get me to my destination safely. Although, when we say total flying time, I assume it means like actual flying time, not just with the simulator, right?
One of the pilots that had been trained on the type by Captain Jacob van Santen and indeed had been checked out by him just a few months earlier was First Officer Klaus Mears, who was going to be flying together with van Santen on this afternoon.
9,200 hours total flying time, also not too bad. And then on the Boeing, only 95 hours. What, 95 hours? That's like several days. I think that's still a pretty decent amount of time. I don't know anything about being a pilot, guys. I think 95 hours of doing a job semi-competently is gonna give you some experience.
Together with them was also flight engineer Wilhelm Schröder, and Wilhelm Schröder was very experienced, and he was also known to not be afraid to speak his mind.
17,000 hours.
Something that we'll see soon enough. At 9 o'clock sharp on the 27th of March 1977, KLM flight 4805 took off from Schiphol, Amsterdam International Airport with 14 crew members and 234 passengers on board and started its travel down towards Las Palmas. As these two aircraft was now making their way down towards their destination, two young men walked into the terminal building in Las Palmas airport. They walked up to the flower shop that was close to the check-in desks, and they stood there for a while before they turned around and hurriedly went outside of the terminal building. Behind, they left a bag, and what no one noticed at the time was that the bag was ticking.
No way! I thought this was just an airplane crash. This had something to do with an attempted terrorist attack? That is crazy.
At exactly 1 o'clock in the afternoon, a desk clerk inside of Las Palmas airport received a phone call from someone claiming that they were a representative of the MPAIAC, saying that there were bombs put inside of the terminal building and that they had exactly 15 minutes to clear the entire building out.
Bruh.
Almost to the second, 15 minutes later, the bomb that was placed inside of the bag next to the flower shop exploded.
Holy!
This caused part of the roof inside of the terminal building to fall down and other widespread damage, as well as injuring 4 people inside of the building. But
I am so glad to hear nobody died from that. I guess at least they had the decency to call ahead and let them know that they need to evacuate so that nobody actually died from this. But holy, bruh.
Remember how the person who called said that there were bombs, as in plural? Well, now the authorities needed to assume that there was more than one bomb inside of the building, so they needed to search it. And because of that, a decision was taken to stop all inbound flights into Las Palmas airport. Almost exactly at the same time as this was happening down on the ground, KLM flight 4805 arrived into a holding pattern above Las Palmas. Initially, they were told to hold, to wait, but pretty soon they were told that we don't know how long this holding is going to take or how long the cleanup is going to take, so you need to divert towards Los Rodeos airport in Tenerife. This meant a short 25-minute flight over towards Los Rodeos, and at time 13:38, the KLM 747 touched down on runway 30 in Los Rodeos airport. They taxied up until almost the terminal building, as far north as they could on the apron, and they parked there. As the KLM flight was diverting, Pan Am flight 1736 had also entered a holding pattern a few thousand feet above the KLM aircraft. They heard the news about the bomb, just like the KLM flight did, and they also asked if they potentially could hold instead of diverting, because they were also holding a lot of extra fuel on board. But just like the KLM flight, the Pan Am flight was also told that no, we will not have any aircraft in our airspace, so please divert over towards Los Rodeos airport. So they did, and they landed at time 14:15, about 37 minutes after the KLM flight, and also taxied to the apron. And at this point, Los Rodeos airport had started to fill up with all of the inbound flights that were supposed to come into Las Palmas, who was now being diverted, which meant that both the apron and the taxiways was now becoming quite crowded with diverted flights. Now let's talk a little bit about the airport that these two aircraft have just diverted to. Los Rodeos airport is situated up in the northeastern corner of Tenerife. It's situated up on a hill at an altitude of about 2,000 feet. Now, Tenerife is dominated by the biggest mountain in Spain, actually, which is a volcano called Pico de Teide. And Pico de Teide creates some quite unique meteorological phenomenon where these humid trade winds that are coming in from the Atlantic is getting pushed up against the mountainside. And when it does so, that cools down, the moisture falls out and starts forming clouds or fog. And that can happen really, really quickly. This also means that down on the southern side of Tenerife, it's almost always sunny. So the kind of weather that you associate with going to the Canary Islands is down south.
Let me guess, the fog was an issue.
But up in the north, it's almost always humid. There's a lot of rain. It's a lot greener. There's a lot of vegetation there. And because the airport is situated at 2,000 feet altitude, it means that even reasonably high clouds, so 2,000 feet high clouds, when they come in over the airport, they touch ground. And this causes a very interesting phenomenon where it's not quite fog, because when you think of fog, you think of something where the visibility stays more or less the same over time, right? Maybe it's 500 meters visibility and it stays the same.
Yeah.
But because what you have here is actually sometimes rolling clouds that are coming in and disappearing, you can have really big variations in visibility where there's maybe 2-3 kilometers visibility in 1 minute and 3 minutes later it's down to 300 meters. When these two aircraft arrived into Tenerife, the visibility was good. It was a good day. But that very quickly started changing, and that's what we're coming to in a minute. Another thing about Los Rodeos Airport is that it had a very poor safety record. Between the years of 1965 and 1968, there was on average 1 crash per year in the airport or in its surroundings, claiming 98 lives.
What? I feel like at that point, if it happens once, okay. But if it happens twice, you definitely have to investigate why there is so many issues. And if it happens 3 times, I expect that someone would do something about this, because 96 people died in 3 years at that airport. That's insane.
And just a few years before this disaster, there had been another serious accident happen. Because of this, a decision had been taken to build a new airport down in the southern part of Tenerife instead, where the weather was much better. This airport was actually paved and almost ready to take into use in 1977, but because of some political infighting, that hadn't happened yet.
I see. Well, to be completely fair to the northern airport, he did describe very, very difficult weather conditions at times. So I understand how, by default, the safety level of the airport could be a little bit impaired. But yeah, in that case, what they did, building a new airport, is definitely better.
This new airport down south actually had ground radar, but Tenerife North, Los Rodeos Airport, did not have ground radar at the time of the accident. When the KLM flight pulled up and parked next to the terminal building, initially Captain Franz Santen and his crew wanted all of the passengers to stay on board. I'm guessing he probably was hoping that this was just going to be a very short ground delay and that they could depart towards Las Palmas almost immediately. But after about 20 minutes, it became clear that this was not going to be the case, and he decided that the passengers could disembark, go into the terminal building, stretch their legs a little bit, maybe grab something at the bar, and he issued them with reboarding passes so that they quickly could get back onto the aircraft if they were told that Las Palmas had opened again. The Pan Am aircraft that came in a little bit later wanted to do the same thing, but were told that the terminal building was now completely full with all of the KLM passengers and that it wouldn't be good to mix the two. So the Pan Am crew...
I mean, I don't see why mixing them would be an issue unless they don't trust the passengers to find the right plane again. But then the planes are both going to the same destination afterwards anyways, right? So even if someone was dumb enough to mix it up, I don't know. I don't see why mixing the passengers would have been a bad idea, to be honest. If any of you guys knows, please let me know.
Decided to keep everyone on board, but they did ask for steps to be brought up towards the aircraft so that the passengers could go up onto the steps, stretch their legs a little bit, get some fresh air while they were waiting. The KLM passengers stayed inside of the terminal building for about 2 hours before they were reboarded. In the Pan Am cockpit, the crew tried to make the best out of the situation. Captain Grubbs made a PA telling all of the passengers that those who wanted could come in and visit the flight deck, and he was guiding them around, showing, this marvelous aircraft. This is the Boeing 747 to them, and the spirit was quite good, even though...
That is really nice, actually, yeah. I don't know if that happened to me. I think I would see it as a quite cool and unique opportunity to be shown around by the pilot, right?
So they had been working for a long time at this point. In the KLM cockpit, though, the mood was very different because Captain van Santen and his first officer and flight engineer had started talking about the recent changes in Dutch flight time limitation legislation. Up until recently, before 1977, there had been quite lax rules regarding how long a pilot could work. But recently, those rules had changed dramatically, and there was now very clear limits to how long you were allowed to operate. And if you, as a captain, went outside of these limitations, you would face a judge and potentially serve jail time.
But isn't that a good thing? Isn't regulations like this good because they prevent the captain from working when they're too tired and stuff like that?
This is what they were discussing because they could clearly see that if the ground delay would become much longer, well, then they would have to go very quickly over towards Las Palmas, have minimum delay there in order to be able to return to Amsterdam and land within these limitations.
Ah, okay, that's what they were complaining about. Well, I think within these limitations, cases like this should definitely be considered so that the pilots are not screwed and don't have to rush, right? 100%.
This made the flight crew quite anxious, right? They did not want to get stuck on Las Palmas. Captain van Santen had his wife at home and his 2 children, and he said specifically that he was afraid that his wife was going to hear the news about the bomb in Las Palmas and become very, very worried if she knew that he was down there and he was overnighting there. So they were really looking into ways that they could minimize the delay as much as possible to get themselves back towards Amsterdam. And this is where Captain van Santen takes a decision that's going to have very dire consequences.
Oh no.
Because he decides that if he's going to be sitting on the ground here, he might as well be uploading as much fuel as he needs to fly over to Las Palmas and to fly back to Amsterdam. That way, he's going to minimize the time on the ground in Las Palmas.
That does make sense. That does sound like not the worst thing to do in that situation because you have a lot of time on your hands anyway, so might as well refuel. I'm not entirely sure if refueling it too much affects the plane in any negative way. I assume it will later have something to do with the crash, but in general I do think that's quite a good idea.
This is a very sound decision. This is something I completely understand myself, because if you're stuck there, why not utilize the time to upload the fuel? But once you start the fueling of a 747, it's a fairly big operation. It's not something that you want to stop. So he was kind of gambling on that this delay was going to take another hour or so for them to be able to complete their fueling process. And crucially, this fueling process was also going to make his jet about 15% more heavy. That would mean that he would need a higher speed in order to take off later on, and also a longer takeoff distance.
Which I assume under normal circumstances would not be an issue at all.
Only minutes after Captain van Santen has initiated refueling of his jet, he gets notice that Las Palmas has now opened again, that he could go and fly over. Weather is still good, but now lower clouds starting to roll in from the hills and the visibility is getting worse minute by minute. Captain Grubbs in the Pan Am flight has heard the same message and he asks for startup, but he is told that unfortunately now the KLM flight is fueling and there is not enough ground clearance for him to be able to maneuver his jet up and past the KLM flight in order to enter the runway and backtrack for departure. He's going to have to wait for the KLM flight to finish refueling and for them to depart before he is allowed to taxi out and take off. When Captain Grubbs heard this, he went out onto the radio frequency and he said, "How long is this fueling going to take?" And Captain van Santen responded from the KLM cockpit saying that it's going to take another 20 minutes to half an hour. Captain Grubbs in the Pan Am cockpit was not happy with this. Instead, he sent out his flight engineer and his first officer to physically measure whether or not they could squeeze by the KLM jet.
I mean, as a passenger, I would say, yo, screw it, it's just 30 minutes more. But I understand that obviously pilots are working with company guidelines and very tight schedules. So I understand why this would be something that they'd want to hurry up.
The April. But when they came back in, they confirmed that the distance was not big enough. It was less than 20 feet short, but it was short. So they would have to sit and wait until the KLM had finished refueling. At the same time, all of the passengers and crew had returned back to the KLM aircraft and were now getting ready for departure. All except one.
Oh.
Mrs. Robina Monique van Lanschot was a worker for the company that had chartered the flights in the first place, and she had her boyfriend actually living on Tenerife. So she had, during the ground time, checked if she could possibly stay there together with him instead of taking the flight back towards Las Palmas. And that was granted. So at the time, all of the other passengers were boarding the flight. She was already in the car, getting away from the airport together with her boyfriend. And that is going to turn her into a very rare statistic.
Damn.
At time 1645, the KLM aircraft had finished refueling and the last pieces of paperwork were delivered to the cockpit. Captain Van Santen and his crew was now trying to complete the before start checklist, and you could hear on the cockpit voice recorder how Captain Van Santen is actually trying to slow things down. He was saying things like, hey, give the man a chance, indicating that the first officer was working on his scan flow at the same time as the checklist was being read. But even though he was trying to moderate the pace, he was then heard just a few minutes later and before the checklist had been completed, calling for startup clearance. And this is something that's normally done by the first officer. So the fact that Captain Van Santen was doing this himself indicate that he was also indeed trying to speed things up. Now, before we go into the accident sequence of this video, I just want to share a few words from my sponsor who's helping me make this kind of content possible. Now, I know that you guys are watching my videos because you love learning new things and finding out the nitty-gritty, nerdy details behind each story. And if that's true, you should seriously check out the sponsor of this episode, which is CuriosityStream.
I think you already had the sponsor in the last Mentor pilot video I watched. I haven't checked it out yet. I'll be honest, I don't have a ton of time currently to watch anything because at the time of recording, the World Cup is still going on. So, you know, I'm kind of busy watching that, but maybe after.
CuriosityStream is a high-quality subscription streaming service with thousands of great non-fictional stories and documentaries from some of the best filmmakers in the world. I am watching a series right now called What Went Wrong, and the last video I saw was the Grenfell Tower fire disaster, which was terrible but also really interesting. If you think, Peter, that sounds really interesting, well then consider supporting me by supporting my sponsor. Go down into the description, click on the link, which is curiositystream.com/mentourpilot, and
there you go. If you want to check out his code, it's right above my head.
Coupon code mentourpilot. That will give you a whopping 25% off the annual subscription fee, which is, wait for it, only $14.99 per year, which
that is crazy because some subscription services want that for a month.
is insane value for money. Now back to the video. At time 1656, the KLM crew had finished starting up their engines and they now were ready to taxi. They went on to the ground controller frequency and were cleared to taxi into holding position for runway 12. When they approached the holding position, they got transferred over to the approach controller, and the approach controller cleared them to enter runway 12, backtrack, and then turn off the runway on the third exit on their left-hand side. The first officer read this back, but instead of reading back the third exit, he read back the first exit, which is kind of easy to understand because third and first can sound very similar, especially on the radio frequency.
And I also imagine in that moment they were pretty stressed and just trying to get started as fast as possible.
When the approach controller heard this misunderstanding, he changed his mind and he changed the clearance to just backtrack all the way, runway 12, until you reach the end of the runway, make a 180-degree turn, and then hold position. This was read back by the first officer. But only a few seconds later, Captain Van Santen came onto the same frequency and asked whether or not he should turn left onto Charlie 1, which is, once again, the first exit on the left-hand side. The approach controller said, no, continue taxi straight ahead. Okay, he said, fine. He continued taxiing down, but when they passed taxiway Charlie 4, which is the fourth exit on the left-hand side, Van Santen again turned over in the cockpit to his first officer and asked whether he should turn off there. This can maybe be interpreted as a little bit of confusion in the KLM cockpit at this time, but with my experience, when you're taxiing in low visibility conditions, it's very, very hard actually. You see very little. It's actually a quite scary situation where you only see a few lights. And in this case, the centerline lights of the runway wasn't working either. So it's quite common that you as a captain, keep asking your first officers to confirm the taxi route and confirm if we should turn this. Whether you have the slightest little doubt about where you are or what you should do, you always ask. So I didn't find that very strange. But it is also possible that Captain Van Santen is now starting to think ahead, and he's starting to think about the flight over to Las Palmas, the potential of delays in Las Palmas, and then the flight back towards Amsterdam and the flight time limitations. And he could start to become a bit distracted. And if that's the case, well, then that could indicate that he's actually losing a little bit of current situational awareness because he is thinking ahead, something that we captains also tend to do, especially when there's trouble brewing. And that could explain the actions that he's about to take next.
I don't even think that this is exclusive to pilots. I think that if you have a specific plan for your day and something comes in between that, you tend to get a bit anxious about it, and your mind tends to go there to try and solve it somehow, like figure out like, how are we going to do this? We could do this and that and this and that. Obviously, in a situation where you're piloting a plane, it's probably important to try and keep the awareness in the here and now to make sure that everything goes well. But it's very human to be distracted when something like that happens, especially if it's like a terrorist attack. Like, that is actually scary. If I was a pilot and there was a bomb exploding at an airport that I was going to land at, I would also be worried that, like, if we go back there, what if there's another bomb? What if there's still terrorist activity? I would be a little bit worried about that.
As the KLM aircraft was taxiing now, the visibility was indicated to be around 500 meters, which is quite bad visibility. But some witnesses at the airport estimated that it could be at times as low as 100 meters. Because they were now in that type of situation that we were talking about before, where there was low clouds that was moving over the runway. And this meant that at times the visibility was really poor, and then one of these clouds could move out of the way and the visibility could improve quite significantly. And this was also indicated because the cockpit voice recorder indicates that the windshield wipers in the KLM cockpit was on for a couple of minutes, but as the aircraft was reaching the end of the runway and started to turn around, they actually turned off the windshield wiper, indicating that the visibility possibly was a little bit better at that part of the runway. At the same time as the KLM aircraft is now backtracking the runway, Clipper 1736, the Pan Am 747, receives their startup clearance. They start up all of their 4 engines and they request taxi clearance. And as they're now taxiing out towards the same holding position for runway 12, Captain Grubbs is indicating to his fellow flight crew members that he would actually like to stay off the runway, to wait until the KLM flight has departed instead of backtracking behind them. Unfortunately, this is never really transmitted onto air traffic control because as he is talking about this, they get several radio calls and also a frequency change. And when they change over to the approach frequency, which is the same frequency as the KLM aircraft is on, the approach controller gives them the clearance to enter runway 12, backtrack, and then turn the 3rd exit towards the left of the runway, which is the same clearance as they originally gave to the KLM aircraft. Now you might ask yourself, if Captain Grubbs did not want to enter the runway, if he wanted to wait behind, why didn't he insist on doing that? Well, that can possibly be explained by the fact that when we're flying into countries where English is not the first language, and when you're speaking to a controller that you can hear has a strong accent and maybe struggling a bit with English, well, then sometimes flight crew members accept clearances that is not their first choice, just in order to make sure that there are no further confusions happening by starting a discussion. And Captain Grubbs actually, in subsequent interviews, indicated that, yeah, that was definitely part of his thinking. In any case, as the aircraft is now entering and backtracking runway, still in fog, there is discussions going on in the cockpit about which exit they were supposed to take. Once again, they're not sure whether or not they should take Charlie 1, which is the first exit to the left, or the 3rd exit to the left. Exactly the same discussion as the KLM crew had had before. Another really important thing to understand about Tenerife is the way that the taxiways are built. So the 3rd exit on the left-hand side, coming from this direction, is actually what we call a high-speed turn-off from the landing runway 30 direction. This means that it's a nice turn-off when you're coming from that direction, but if you're backtracked in runway, like these 2 aircraft did, it would require a very steep 148-degree turn to the left,
Yeah.
followed by another 148-degree turn to the right to follow the parallel taxiway. That might be possible for a smaller aircraft, but for a large aircraft like the 747, it would be practically impossible, especially the second turn onto the taxiway. And this is why the flight crew members, when they're discussing this, they're actually talking about maybe the controller meant Charlie 4 rather than Charlie 3. So the fourth exit on the left. This is a high-speed turnoff from runway 12, which gives a nice 35-degree turnoff from the runway.
And that one looks like the one that makes the most sense for that plane to take if it has a lot of trouble turning that steeply.
Would make much more sense. Before the Pan Am crew could get on to the frequency and confirm which taxiway they were supposed to turn left on, the approach controller actually came in and he asked, KLM 4805, can you confirm which taxiway you just passed? First officer in the KLM flight came back and said, yeah, we think that we've just passed Charlie 4, indicating that the visibility was still quite bad. Now, I want you to note that the approach controller frequently made pauses in his transmission. So he started off the transmission and then he held it there for a while until he continued, indicating that he might have to think a little bit about what he was about to say. And this is going to have a disastrous consequence in just a few minutes from now. At time 17:03 and 29 seconds, the Pan Am first officer came onto the frequency and asked, confirm we are to taxi off on the third exit, really putting emphasis on the word third. The approach controller came in and said, affirm, taxi off on the third exit, 1, 2, 3, third. Pan Am answered, okay, thank you. And this is important because the cockpit voice recorder in the KLM cockpit indicated that at this specific time there was complete silence inside of the cockpit, indicating that the flight crew members was listening out to the frequency. And there is a possibility that what they thought they heard was that the Clipper 1736, the Pan Am aircraft, was looking at the exit they were about to turn onto and calling air traffic control just to confirm that this was the correct exit that they needed to take. In that case, this aircraft was just about to turn off the runway. In reality, the Clipper 1736 was just calling to confirm which taxiway they were about to take. They were much further down the runway. In the Pan Am cockpit, there was a relaxed atmosphere. They were making jokes in Spanish, saying uno, dos, tres, kind of indicating that they were going to take the first, second, the third exit on the left-hand side. And they also at this point started doing their before takeoff checklist. The cockpit voice recorder in the Pan Am aircraft indicates that the pilots were looking out to see the taxiways as they passed. They call out things like, there is one, there's the second one. But curiously, there is no mentioning of the third one, which is what they were cleared to taxi off on. And the reason for that is possibly because they were listening out to the ATC frequency just as KLM started receiving their departure clearance. They have never been to this airport before. They were probably very interested in hearing what kind of clearance this aircraft was going to get, since they were going to do the exact same flight. And it is very possible that all of the flight crew members, as they were taxiing through the fog, when KLM was receiving their route clearance, was just focusing on that clearance, and they missed the third taxiway, the one that they were supposed to turn off on, and continued taxi down the runway towards the fourth exit. At time 17:03 and 47 seconds, the approach controller comes onto the frequency and says, 7135, report when leaving the runway. Now, this is the incorrect call sign for the Pan Am flight, but they understand that it's for them, and they just respond 1736. This is a common way of accepting, basically the same as saying Wilco. But the problem here is that if you are in another aircraft in the mindset that your only obstacle on the runway just saw their turn off, and then you hear this message, you might misinterpret that as a confirmation of being clear of the runway, rather than a confirmation of going to report when.
And because this happened in the past, there was no way for the flight controller to know that where they were exactly. Because in the other video that we watched, where it was also like almost a collision on the airstrip, they did have a ton of systems in place to make sure that something like that can't happen. But this was the 70s, so...
We are clear of the runway. We will never know if this is what happened in the KLM cockpit, but it is likely that something like this did happen. A few seconds later, the approach controller once again comes onto the frequency and gives a message to both the KLM flight crew and the Pan Am flight crew. And he says that the centerline lights are out of service. He did this in response to an earlier question that Captain Van Santen had asked regarding if they could get centerline lights. And the significance of this is that without centerline lighting, your minimum visibility that you're required to have in order to do a takeoff actually goes up quite a lot. It goes up to over 800 meters. This was discussed inside of the Pan Am cockpit, but it wasn't discussed in the KLM cockpit, and that could potentially be because at the point they were at the runway, the visibility might be much better than it was where the Pan Am flight crew was. 2,000 meters away from the Pan Am aircrafts, at the very end of the runway, KLM flight 8504 has now completed its 180 degrees turnaround and is facing straight down into the takeoff direction.
So with the visibility, if the visibility is that bad and a couple meters later it can be as low as 100 meters, is it smart to even let them start? Because yeah, it might be 800 meters where they're at, but if they start taking off, it could be way, way lower, the visibility. I don't know, man. I don't know. It does seem like a very terrible place for an airport if that is something they deal with regularly, because I feel like visibility is kind of important upon takeoff for a plane. I don't know.
As soon as the turn is complete, Captain Jacob van Santen starts advancing his thrust levels to stabilize them for takeoff. But here is where his first officer, Mers, cuts in and says, "Wait a minute, we haven't got any clearance." Captain van Santen reduces his thrust back to idle again and just says, "I know that. Go ahead, ask." First Officer Mers, in a little bit of a hurry, goes onto the frequency and says, KLM 8504, we are ready for takeoff and we are waiting for ATC clearance. By saying it this way, it can be construed that First Officer Mers is asking both for a takeoff clearance and en route clearance at the same time. Remember, they haven't received the clearance, which is how they are supposed to navigate after they depart. They need to have that before they depart, but they also need to get takeoff clearance in order to start the takeoff roll. The approach controller comes in, he has been waiting for the KLM crew to ask for ATC clearance, and he gives them the following clearance. KLM 8705, once again the wrong call sign. You are cleared to the Papa Beacon, climb to and maintain flight level 90, right turn after takeoff to proceed on heading 040 degrees to intercept radial 325 towards Las Palmas VOR. This clearance includes the word takeoff in the mind of Captain Jacob van Santen, who thinks that the runway is now completely clear and that this clearance both gives him the clearance for takeoff and en route clearance, responds with a "yeah" and start advancing the thrust level.
That is ironically very funny, even though like what is about to happen is very tragic. Man.
First Officer Mers, who's have to read this clearance back, you can hear on the cockpit voice recorder, is getting quite stressed, and he reads back, "Roger sir, we are cleared to the Papa Beacon, flight over 90, right turn 050 degrees until intercepting 325, and we are now at takeoff." While he is still reading this clearance back, Captain van Santen has said, "Let's go, check thrust," and advanced the thrust level to the takeoff position. This is likely why he added on, "We are now at takeoff," or "We are taking off." It has been impossible during the examination of the cockpit voice recorder to actually hear exactly what it is that he says, but in any case, it definitely said under stress. The time is now 17:06 and 11 seconds, and in about 39 seconds, the worst aviation disaster in history is about to happen. But at this point, there are still 3 things that could have potentially stopped it from happening. Because as the approach controller hears the readback from the first officer, he interprets the "we are at takeoff" as in "we are at takeoff position," which is what he is expecting them to say. So he responds with "okay," and then he waits a few seconds and "stand by for takeoff, I will call you." But the Pan Am aircraft, who's still taxiing down the runway, they think that they hear that the KLM aircraft is about to take off. So the first officer goes in, and at the same time as the approach controller is calling on the frequency, he also calls. And he says, "We are still taxiing down the runway, Clipper 1736. The problem is that those two messages, when they're being transmitted at the same time, causes interference on the frequency.
No.
So the only thing that is heard in the KLM cockpit is the ATC controller's okay. And then a really shrill noise comes out.
Oh no.
None of the two other stations that were calling, not the controller, not the aircraft, could hear this shrill noise. So this means that effectively KLM has only heard okay. The approach controller now thinks that he's given a fairly clear message to the KLM aircraft, and he refocuses his attention on the Pan Am aircraft instead. And he calls them saying, "Papa Alpha 1736, confirm when you're clear of the runway." Clipper 1736 comes back and said, "Affirm, we will confirm when we are clear of the runway, Clipper 1736. As these messages are being sent out on the frequency, the KLM aircraft is now accelerating down the runway.
Oh no.
And as the speed builds up, they're likely getting into worse visibility. This requires more focus and more attention by the pilots, but one of the pilots, the flight engineer, Schröder, he actually has a little bit lower workload at this point, and he listens into these radio messages. And at time 17:06:30, he leans forward and says, "So, are they not clear of the runway then?" Captain Van Santen, who is deeply focused on the takeoff role, doesn't hear what he says at first, so he says, "What did you say?" And flight engineer Schröder says, "So, is it not clear of the runway then, the Pan Am?" Now, Captain Santen just says in a very convincing voice, "Oh yes." And those were the last three things that could have stopped this disaster from happening.
Man.
In the Pan Am cockpit, the pilots have now passed the third taxiway to the left that they were supposed to leave on, and they're now taxiing down towards the fourth exit instead.
To me, like even driving when it's slightly foggy or when it's like snowing is so freaking stressful because I'm afraid of like getting too close to another car. I understand that planes do have a lot of like free space in front of them, so a crash is highly unlikely. But just the thought of being responsible for so many passengers and going in such low visibility conditions gives me anxiety. I assume that it's a thing that still happens from time to time for pilots, but oh man, I couldn't do it.
The mood in the cockpit is actually quite relaxed, and they're making fun a little bit about the KLM captain and his perceived impatience at this point, because they have been the ones who've been waiting for him to finish fueling. Mm-hmm. At time 17:06:38, this is 11 seconds prior to the collision, Captain Grubbs is looking out through his windshield and he starts to see the headlights of the KLM aircraft. Initially, he thinks that they're standing still, so he just says, "Oh, there he is." But very quickly he understands that these headlights are not standing still, and he exclaims, "Oh, God damn it, that son of a bitch is coming, he's coming." First Officer Braggs responds with, get off! And Captain Grubbs just gives full tiller to the left, tries to get his jet out into the grass and away from the oncoming 747.
Fuck.
He adds full thrust, but his aircraft weighs about 340 tons and it will not accelerate that quickly. The highest speed that they managed to get up to prior to the collision is about 20 knots. In the KLM cockpit, Captain Van Santen has heard V1 and he's just getting ready to start rotating his aircraft for takeoff when he suddenly sees the silhouette of the now turning Pan Am 747 straight ahead of him. He reacts by pulling his yoke all the way to the back, causing a tail strike at the back of the aircraft, leaving about 20 meters of metal scrapings on the runway. The last words that he says is a Dutch profanity, "Oh God, verdomme," as the aircraft gets momentarily airborne just a second prior to the collision. The number 4 engine, situated on the right-hand wing of the KLM jet, now slices into the first-class lounge of the Pan Am jet, which is the upper part of the bulge of the 747. The main landing gear tears into the body as the left wing tears off the empennage and the fin of the Pan Am jet, causing severe destruction. The KLM jet continues to fly for another 150 meters or so before it sinks back onto the runway runway, this time without its landing gear, which has been torn off in the collision.
God.
The jet continues to slide for another couple of hundred meters, slightly to the right of centerline, turning slightly clockwise as it does. But as soon as it touches down, a wild fire breaks out, and all 248 passengers and crew on board are lost.
Fuck. I thought that maybe if they like still fall down, it could be that they just like survive. But yeah, fire is deadly, unfortunately.
In the Pan Am aircraft, there's now complete pandemonium.
Oh my
Most
God.
passengers did not have time to even understand what happened. And in the cockpit, all 3 pilots have actually managed to survive the initial impact. But as the flight engineer is grabbing for the fire handles in the roof to try to turn off the engines, he finds himself just grabbing in thin air because that part of the cockpit
Oh
roof
my
had
God.
been torn off in the collision. All of the passengers that were seated in the first class lounge died on impact, and most of the passengers who actually survived actually managed to get out of holes in the body from the first class lounge below that bulge and the cockpit.
Man.
They couldn't open the emergency exit because the whole structure of the aircraft had been severely bent by the impact. And they found themselves having to jump out, and that's a jump of almost 20 feet or 6 meters
Oh
down
my
onto the asphalt.
God.
Some passengers also managed to escape from the back of the aircraft through a hole in the roof, climbing out onto the wings and then down onto the asphalt from there. But out of the 396 people on board the Pan Am aircraft, only 61 survived the crash.
It sounded like a really terrible crash, so I am glad that at least 61 people survived. But oh my God, awful.
The air traffic controller has no idea that this tragic event has happened because, remember, the airport is not equipped with ground radar and the visibility during this event was so poor that there was absolutely no chance for him to see from the tower that this happened. If this would have happened just a few minutes later, the visibility would have gone up so far that it's unlikely that the event would have taken place in the first place. In any case, one of the aircraft that was sitting on a taxiway reported that they could see flames on the runway. This prompted the air traffic controller to hit the alarm button, which sent out the rescue team out onto the runway. But the firefighters had to drive really, really slowly because of the fog to make sure that they didn't run over someone on the runway. The first thing they noticed of the accident was immense radiation heat as they got closer to the accident site. Then, out of the fog, they could see the outline of this huge 747 now fully engulfed in flames, which was the KLM jet. They started fighting this fire, but they also realized that further down the runway it looked like there was another fire going, and they assumed that this was just a part of the KLM jet. Anyway, they split their forces in two, and one part of the firefighting force went down and realized very quickly that they were looking at yet another Boeing 747 that was also on flames. Now, they very quickly realized that there was nothing they could do on the KLM. It was completely consumed by fire at this point. So they put their forces in to try to rescue as much as they could on the Pan Am jet. And they managed, through the use of extensive water and foam, to secure a large quantity of aviation fuel that had gotten out onto the runway and kept it from igniting, which likely saved a lot of people that was now evacuating out of the Pan Am jet.
So that's why the refueling was a mistake, because the fuel is very flammable. Oh man.
This horrendous accident shocked the whole world, and the investigation started immediately. Fortunately, they could get a hold of the cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder from both aircraft relatively quickly. And in the Spanish final report, they put most of the blame onto the KLM captain, Captain Jacob van Santen. It stated that the accident was caused by the KLM captain taking off without an ATC clearance, not stopping the takeoff when air traffic control told him to stand by for takeoff, not stopping the takeoff when the Pan Am aircraft reported that they were still on the runway, and also not abandoning the takeoff when his own flight engineer asked him whether or not the Pan Am aircraft was still on the runway.
I can understand that theoretically he's at fault here. It seems like there was a lot of misunderstandings involved. To be fair, when the engineer said something, that was probably the one moment that he consciously could have stopped it. But at that point, I think he was also way too focused on actually taking off in that horrible visibility.
Now, the Dutch investigation team had a slightly different view than what was stated in the final report from the Spanish. They didn't question the cause of the accident, which was clearly that the KLM crew had taken off without a takeoff clearance. But instead, they delved a little bit deeper into why this happened. How come that an experienced captain like Captain Jacob van Santen would take a decision like that? And they looked into suboptimal teamwork between the cockpit crews in both aircraft and air traffic control, possibly due to language barriers, but they also looked into whether or not the ATC controller might have been slightly distracted. There was some noise indicated on the ATC tapes that would have indicated that the controller might have been potentially looking at a football game at the same time.
Huh. Well, it does seem like there was some issues with the air traffic controller, as in language barrier, because it did seem like both captains had issues understanding him multiple times. So that could definitely be an issue. I think in that case, it's probably important to hire people that have a minimal accent. As much as I want to respect people with an accent, accents are completely normal to have, but understanding each other is very, very important too.
They also looked into the psychological factors that could have influenced the crew in the KLM cockpit to have taken the decisions that they took. Now, I know that a lot of the stories, movies, videos, and books that has been made about this horrendous accident has focused a lot of attention on the power distance in the cockpit of the KLM jet between the very experienced training captain, Captain Jacob van Santen, and his first officer, Meurs. And the fact that his first officer wouldn't feel comfortable in speaking up against his captain. But that kind of takes away from the fact that First Officer Meurs was far from a new pilot. He had 9,200 hours. He was new on the 747, but he was a very experienced pilot. And he did speak up. Remember when Captain Van Santen wanted to start the takeoff roll as soon as he turned the aircraft around? It was First Officer Meurs who spoke up and said, no, stop, hold on, we need to get our ATC clearance. And that would indicate that he definitely was able to speak up against Captain Van Santen. And the fact that Van Santen started his takeoff roll while he was still reading back the ATC clearance definitely disturbed him, but it is very likely that he still thought that the runway ahead was clear, that there was no danger, and what Van Santen was doing was a procedural mistake, but nothing more than that. And this is why I think it was very important that the Dutch investigation team actually did add their notes onto this final report and started looking for the root causes to why this mistake happened in the first place. Was it because Captain Jacob van Santen was an instructor pilot that spent a lot of time in the simulator and was used to giving out his own ATC clearances? We'll never know, but what we do know is that these notes, together with the Spanish final report, did end up causing a lot of discussions about crew resource management and the importance of intra-cockpit discussions, but also how important it is to have very clear and unambiguous phraseology between traffic control and pilots, so that these kind of mistakes and these kind of misunderstandings could never happen.
Yeah, like I was blaming the visibility, and as much as I want to only blame the visibility, it was clear there was tons of misunderstandings here. So 100% work on the language, yes.
For example, now we never use the word takeoff unless it is together with a takeoff clearance. We call it departure instead. Also from this investigation came rules about the need for very clear taxiway markings so that flight crew could easily find them even in low visibility procedures, and the importance of using ground radar whenever possible. Now, this accident was without a doubt one of the darkest moments in aviation history. But as an industry, we did what we always try to do. We take these hard-earned lessons and we try to use them to make the industry both better and safer for everyone involved. Just like we did after this accident, which actually turned out to be the beginning of the end of the Concorde. Now, if you like what I do here on the channel, then consider becoming part of my Patreon crew and maybe join up in my next weekly hangout. Or get yourself a t-shirt. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time.
Whew, another depressing one. Very, very sad and tragic. Rest in peace to the people who died. And I think this was definitely an avoidable accident, but there was a lot of unfortunate circumstances falling into it, as he said in the beginning. So just extremely, extremely unfortunate. I'm really glad that they at least learned something from it and changed stuff up so that something like that wouldn't happen again. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye!